Hello, and welcome back to the Financing Climate Action Conference at the iGEM. Thank you all for joining us in this segment where we will explore the topic of green bonds in Sukuk and what it means to invest in green. Before I hand over the floor to our moderator, Mr. Michael Ching Chi Hung, I'd like to remind you all to ask these panelists a lot of questions. So let's go to our moderator. Mr. Michael Ching is the Director of CH&I Architecture Sendirian Berhad and V Green Design Sendirian Berhad, both established in 2010. He is a professional architect, a member of Green Building Index Technical Committee, and Honorary Secretary of the Malaysia Green Building Council, Malaysia GBC. With over 20 years of experiences with several international firms, his passion and active interests are in sustainable design. His works were published both locally and internationally and have been recognized in the field of sustainability with the Silver Award from My Dream House 2011 under the Green Home category. He is also the recipient for 30 Under 40 Emerging Architects Malaysia in 2011. Without further ado, let's begin. Mr. Michael, the floor is yours.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Today, this is actually segment B, which will start at 3 and will end around 4:50. So we have original time. We have 3 speaking slots. Speaking on the section 4 will be Ms. Zalina and Mr. Yo Tet Ling, and on the section 5, we'll have a pre-recorded for Mr. Sean Kidney. And section 6, we're supposed to have Mr. Andrew Loss, but unfortunately, he unable to join this time. So we only have 3, and we will end this session a little bit earlier. So with that, I would like to start off with the speakers number 4. The title is actually Green Sukuk, Financing for Green Building. The synopsis with the Islamic finance recognized as being part of the sustainable investment universe, the prospect of raising capital via green sukuk has become a more mainstream option for the green project owners. This session will showcase how green sukuk facilitates access to finance for sustainable projects such as green building, provide financial solutions to environmental challenge, and how to create an enabling environment for mobilizing private capital for financing green buildings. We have 2 speakers today. The first one is Cik Puan Sarina Samsudin, General Manager of Capital Market Malaysia. She's currently the GM for Capital Markets Malaysia and affiliated of Securities Commission Malaysia, mandate with promoting Malaysia capital market both domestically and internationally. She joins the company in June 2014 as the head of strategy and business department. She has over 20 years of experience, predominantly on corporate advisory, and has worked in 5 countries in different regions of Asia, the Middle East, and the Indian subcontinent. Her key skills are in analyzing and identifying solutions for long-term growth and sustainability. She returns to Malaysia in 2011 and joined Invest KL, a promotional agency for Malaysia Capital and the largest city in Kuala Lumpur, as the head of advisory and research. She holds an MBA in Finance and Cash Business School UK, and is a fellow of the Associations of Certified Chartered Accountants. Our second speaker is Mr. Yo Tet Ling, and a lot of people call him Tech. He's the head of the capital market groups at our investment Berhad, and is responsible for the originations of execution of the full capital markets product suites. This includes SUSOC, bonds, loan syndications, assets-backed securitizations, bond syndicates, and the structurings of rates and currency swaps for new insurance. He has 20 years of experience in capital markets and has led numerous award-winning and groundbreaking transactions. He's previously headed the debt capital markets team at Standard Chartered Bank Malaysia Berhad and ABN AMRO Bank Berhad. With that, without further ado, let us welcome both speakers to start their session. Thank you.
Hi, Michael. Thank you very much for that detailed introduction. Thank you very much. Before I start, I'd like to thank the Malaysian Green Building Council for inviting us on this platform, this interesting international platform, and share our experience on Green Sukuk. As Michael mentioned, I represent Capital Markets Malaysia. We're an affiliate of the Securities Commission Malaysia, which is the regulator for the capital market. The topic of discussion today is how green projects, and in particular green buildings, can leverage on Green Sukuk to finance their projects going forward. If you just give me a second, I'm just going to share you my screen and we can start the presentation. All right, as I mentioned, I represent Capital Markets Malaysia. As an affiliate of the SC, we were set up to position and to profile the Malaysian capital market domestically and internationally to support in the advancement of the use of the capital market products and services in financing and funding the Malaysian economy, and also as investment opportunities for investors abroad. Today's topic is to discuss about green finance and how it could be used for green buildings. I'm going to start off by giving a very brief definition of what green finance and green building is before I go into details of the Malaysian experience in this space. Now, green finance by definition, as defined by ADB, suggests that it involves traditional markets creating and distributing a range of financial products and services that provide investable returns and environmentally positive outcomes. Now, this trend has been happening in the last 15 years or so, whereby the capital market and finances generally have realized that given the importance of climate change and the need to prioritize long-term sustainability, we've realized that financing plays a critical role, and there's been a shift in creating awareness to prioritize green financing to support the economy's shift towards meeting sustainable development goals. Now, the area of why buildings are important is because from what was produced by data produced by World Green Building Council, green buildings account for 39% of all carbon emissions in the world. That 39%, if you break it down, 28% is from operational emissions, which means energy efficiency, and 11% comes from the upfront carbon in terms of the materials and construction processes used throughout the building life cycle. So usually people tend to associate green finance with renewable energy, but in reality, there are so many other sectors that can leverage on green finance as well. I'm just going to define what green building is, which I'm sure the audience already know, considering you're all members of the Green Building Council, but let me just go through the definition anyway. A green building is a building that in its design, construction, or operation reduces or eliminates the impact, negative impacts, and creates positive impact on the environment. Just to give you some data, globally, in 2019, green buildings, for the funding of green buildings, 66 billion green bonds were issued. Let me say that again. In 2019, 66 billion US dollars worth of green bonds were issued for the financing of green buildings. Okay, and that accounted for 28% of total green bonds issuances globally last year. Now, let me go back to what's happening here in Malaysia. The SC, the regulator of capital markets, has been promoting sustainable finance since as early as 2010, when we came out with the Capital Market Master Plan in 2011, which was the master plan for what the capital market will do for the following 10 years. And in that master plan, we already identified that sustainability and environmental issues were critical in corporate decision making. In that same year, the SE also came out with a corporate governance blueprint, which said that the boards had to play a critical role in the understanding of environment, social, and governance aspects of business, and to incorporate that in decision making. So as you can see, the SE has been promoting sustainable finance as early on as 2010, before the interest that has been growing in the last few years. Fast track to 2014, the SE then launched the SRI Sukuk framework. The SRI Sukuk framework stands for the Sustainable and Responsible Investment Sukuk framework, which was predominantly developed to facilitate fundraising for projects in a Sharia compliant way. And this is where the Sukuk product has come on. Historically, people tend to associate green finance with conventional products, which are the green bonds. And then, as I mentioned the stats earlier, globally, green bonds has been leveraged as a financing product. Here in Malaysia, to leverage on our global leadership in Islamic finance, and to also leverage on the fact the alignment between Islamic finance and sustainable and responsible investments, the SE started innovating in terms of product range and services in the Islamic capital market side, and to see how we could provide products for the funding of sustainable projects. And that's how the SRI Sukuk framework came about. So the SRI Sukuk framework talks about a Sharia compliant fixed income product that can be used to fund green projects and social projects as well. Now, the SRI Sukuk framework is compatible with the green bond principles, and it can be used for financing various green projects, be it renewable energy, green buildings, energy efficient transportation, and the likes of such. Now, let me just explain a little bit about the green bond principles. This was introduced by the International Capital Market Association, which represents the capital market players globally. And they came out with the green bond principles to say that these were the framework by which what a green project would be, and how the funding for a green project can be put together and can be utilized for green projects. In addition to issuing the SRI Sukuk framework, the SE also put in place other factors to support this facilitative framework, whereby it came out with a tax incentive for SRI Sukuk issuances. What that means is all issuance costs for an SRI Sukuk is tax deductible. And originally this tax incentive was to expire in 2020, but we managed to extend it to 2023. Now, the caveat for the use of this tax incentive is that 90% of the proceeds of any SRI Sukuk issuance has to be used on green projects, has to be used for funding or financing of green projects. The last sort of incentive or support that the SE has provided is in the form of the Green SRI Sukuk Grant Scheme. Excuse me. Which is being administered by CMM ourselves. This is a grant that's in the amount of 6 million. And what this grant is done is that we will be able to utilize it to reimburse any second opinion or any rating opinion on the greenness of a project. Now, I'm just going to explain this aspect of it as well. So essentially, for a green project to be verified to qualify for SRI Sukuk framework, it needs to have an independent expert opinion to reinforce the fact that it is green or sustainable by international standards. And this is an additional cost beyond the normal cost of issuing a bond or a Sukuk. Recognizing that this cost could be a possible concern in terms of increasing cost of financing, SE then put together this grant whereby the grant will reimburse up to 90% of the cost of getting independent experts. So in a nutshell, you have a regulatory framework that supports and provides some level of definition of what green projects are. There's a tax incentive in play for this cost of issuance, and there's also a grant to defray the cost of getting independent expert opinions on the greenness or the sustainability-ness of the project. Now, the next slide is just to give you a rough idea of what the Sukuk framework is about. And the reason why I wanted to share this slide was it guides potential issues on what are the things that you need to be looking at or disclosing when you raise a green Sukuk. All right. So the framework goes on to outline that you must be clear in terms of what you're going to utilize the proceeds for. What is the process for determining the project evaluation and selection? How you're going to manage the disbursement of the proceeds and how you're going to report it. So that's in a nutshell. I'm just going to go through that very quickly by stage. Utilization of the proceeds. You need to be clear, you need to disclose and make sure that whatever funds that are raised with the issuance of an SRI Sukuk are only used for the purpose of funding activities or transactions related to eligible SRI Sukuks. I will go into eligible SRI Sukuks in a few minutes. Besides identifying the projects, you then need to identify a process on how you evaluate these projects. As I mentioned earlier, how do you ensure that they are eligible SRI projects, and how did you select that project? So you must have an evaluation process, and it must be disclosed as well. Thirdly, you must show that the funds or the proceeds are ring-fenced, put into a designated account, and the utilization of those funds are tracked in a manner to show that the funds are only used for the ring-fenced projects. And lastly, and the most important part of it is reporting. So as I mentioned earlier, you have before an issuance, you have a pre-issuance independent review, whereby you hire an independent body like Zero or RAM to rate or to give assurance that the projects are green or sustainable. Now, reporting requires you to do an annual reporting post-issuance on the amount of money that was raised, the amount of money that has been utilized, amount of money has not been utilized, and what it will be utilized on. And you also have to identify the list of projects, should you have more than one, on what the funds are going to be used for financing. Now, on the right-hand side of my slide, we have listed down the potential projects that can be considered green, social, and responsible. I'm not going to go into details of this because you can find it in the SRI Sukuk framework, which is found on the SE website. I'm mindful of the fact that the audience would be interested on green buildings only. So I would like to just highlight here, I'm not sure whether you can see my mouse, but green buildings is considered an eligible project under the SRI Sukuk framework. Okay, so just to let you know, since 2014, when the framework first came out, today, Malaysia has experienced 12 green Sukuk issuances in this space. Of the 12 green Sukuk issuances, 1 was social, 10 were in renewable energy, and 1 was for a green building, which is the PNB Merdeka issuance, which I have a slide here on. Just to give you some numbers in terms of the amount of funds raised, out of the 12 green Sukuk issuances, 7 issuances were averaging about 230 to 250 million ringgit. 3 issuances were for amount of 1 billion and above, and 2 issuances were hovering between 400 to 500 million ringgit. So that's just to give you quantum in terms of how much funds were normally raised in this space. Now, I'm just going to focus on the PNB Merdeka issuance. That was our first Sukuk issuance, green Sukuk issuance, that also was recognized under the ASEAN Green Sukuk Guidelines, which was developed under ACMF, which is the Association of ASEAN Capital Market Regulators. Now, PNB issued this sukuk in 2017, and the value of the sukuk was 2 billion. The sukuk was used to fund their premier building at the moment, which is currently being built, which is an 83-story office space called Merdeka PNB 118 Tower. Okay, now to get it certified as a green building, PNB then went on to get 3 green building certifications as mentioned here. And to verify the greenness of the project, PNB got the second opinion by CCU. And subsequently to that, for the annual reporting, PNB hired an external auditor for the periodic reporting. Mute themselves, please. Okay, so if you can hear me, the lead arranger was, the lead advisor was MIDF, and the arrangers were MIDF and RHB. So that's in a nutshell what the PNB Merdeka issuance looks like. And I've given you a flavor of how the SRI Sukuk framework has been developed, what were the definitions of what projects are, and what would be the requirements to issue an SRI Sukuk framework. I'm now going to pass this on to Tech, who will give you more details in terms of the structure and in terms of the take-up. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Alina. I hope you all can hear me. I think I was asked by Zelina just to come online today to also talk about another transaction that AM Investment Bank has also done in the market. This is in essence for a company called Segi Astana, which is a 70% and owned by WCT and 30% owned by MEHB. So in essence, what we did was that we raised 415 million in the market for the project. The special purpose vehicle here was actually established for the privatization and construction, development and financing for Gateway at KLIA2. So this includes the commercial complex, the car park, and also the transportation hub. So it was all done on the basis that this would be a 25-year concession. So it also has a tail end extension option for about 10 years. So the concession runs till 2036, assuming that the extension option isn't, isn't agreed upon between MEHB and Segi Astana. So in essence, as I said, we raised about 415 million in January 2018. The entire deal was rated AA- by Mark, and it was really for the redemption of 400 million of non-green sukuk that was actually guaranteed by Dana Jamin beforehand. So in essence, what happened was that in the refinancing of it, we raised another 415 in the form of ASEAN Green Bond Standards sukuk. So as what Zelina mentioned, we have 4 points that we needed to tick off in order to make sure that it's a ASEAN Green Bond. And this includes the issue around use of proceeds, the project evaluation and selection, the management of the proceeds, and the reporting commitments. So in essence, the transaction has since been put into the market. We obtained a second opinion from RAM Consultancy. That was the first second opinion ever done by RAM Consultancy for a building or a green building. And the Gateway at KLIA2 was the building which achieved what we call a LEED Silver certification. This includes things like energy efficiency due to lighting and power reductions, rainwater harvesting systems, centralized waste disposal, dedicated areas for collection, and sensor lights. So maybe I'll stop there. And if there are any further questions or queries, happy to take any of that.
Thanks, Ted. At the moment, there isn't any questions being posed. Let me just check. Yes, there is. Oh, there's a few actually. Shall I read? And both you and Sarina maybe can address them. The first one is by Punita, and she actually asked, what is considered as green project?
Okay, Michael, shall I take that one?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so it was Bonita. So the green projects, as I mentioned in my slide earlier, there are many definitions of what falls under the category of green. I think if you were to use a general definition, it says anything that reduces the negative impact on the environment and contributes positively on the environment. If you go to the SC website and Google SRI Sukuk framework, that gives you sort of a rough idea what qualifies as a green. We're happy to share my slides with you as well, so that will give you a little bit more of an understanding of what is green.
Can I add on?
Yeah, please, Michael, you're the expert here.
In Malaysia, there are several green body certifications. These bodies actually certified green building, and they have criteria to be fulfilled in order to be classified as green building. So just like obtaining your driving license, and anybody can claim that they can drive, but in order to be drive legally, you need to obtain a license from JBJ. So in order to be claimed as green building in Malaysia, that suits the local context, local culture, local climate, you need to obtain a certification that recognized locally in order to claim that you are green building. So in Malaysia, there are a few green certification body. The most established will be Green Building Index, GBI, where they are headed by the Architects and Engineers Board of Association, the PAM and the SM. So the technical aspects of the building, which is the architect side, engineering side, are being covered because these two associations actually owns GBI. So with that, I think it's really easy. If you want, you just go to GBI website, and whatever building listed in that website is considered green building. Perhaps I can, whatever I add on, able to add value. Let's move on to the second question by Mok Z Lim Mok Z, I think. His question is, the 10 sukuks for renewable energy, are these for solar power projects or other types of renewable energy? So basically, the renewable energy, are they solar powers?
Hank, you want to take that one?
Yeah. Maybe I'll take that in a different form. I think the answer to that is we've only seen two green sukuk that have been raised for buildings to date. So this includes the PNB Merdeka Ventures, which was mentioned by Zalina, and also what we've done for Segi Astana, which is the gateway at KLIA 2. So obviously, we as market practitioners would be very keen to see more issuances from the green building sector. So yes, for the large part, the current move towards green has been obviously in the renewable energy sector. because that's a big push by the government, predominantly because the government has a stated desire to get at least 20% of our energy from renewable energy sources. So, I guess it's a multi-pronged effort to try to green the world.
Okay, I'll move on to the third question. The question is, I think, not direct to the speakers. Can I get the presentation slides? So I think the organizer can answer that question. Next question from Punita again. Take note on the explanation given. However, what is the considered as green project is still very weak, because unless it's being very clearly like recycle and renewable energy, etc., what we can get more information and specifics can the information, both technical and financial, be centralized and make available on one single platform and make it easily available? I think I have just mentioned just now, there is actually a body to help you to define green building and certified green building. Just go to there and everything will be covered. It's much easier than defining on ourselves. Hopefully we can be Punita satisfied with the answer. Let's move on to the fifth question. Valerie, the question is, apart from financing green building, have there been other case of issuance of SRR Sukuk? I think also answer, but I'll leave it back to the speakers.
I'll take that, Selena. The answer is yes. There have been SRI Sukuks that have also been issued in the market. Of course, the more famous one has been the SRI Sukuk that has been done by Khazanah. This was specifically for the setting up of special schools that throughout the country. So this was under their Ihsan Sukuk. But that at least was the precursor. But what we've seen is that since then, a lot of other green sukuk have also been able to tick the box under SRI. So the answer is yes, there have been SRI sukuks since in terms of issuance, but have they been specifically with regards to green buildings? The answer is again, no. They've been in relation to other type of projects. And maybe if I can, Michael, back to Punita's question earlier, I think we all agree that the definition of green and the taxonomy of green is still something that a lot of people are still sort of kicking the ball around with. But I think, as what Michael says, there are enough bodies out there where you can at least bounce off of them to try to determine whether your projects are green or not. As what Zalina mentioned, there is actually a lot of I would say resources available online for you to check under the SC, and even the definition of what is an SRI Sukuk is out there. So really, if there is any questions, you can refer to that. Ultimately, if not Zalina and myself, I guess we can always take a few calls from everyone.
Okay, let's move on to the next question. I'm not very clear of the question, but I'll read it out. Is there any authority in Malaysia assessing the opportunity itself to build a new building, especially in this time where Malaysia, mini KL, is facing oversupply of the area to rent or sell? Basically, I think the question is whether there's anybody as controlling the building to be built in KL, Malaysia, in order to face the current situation where it's oversupply. I think that's the question. Not very sure.
I don't think we would be in the place to answer that question. valid question, but I think there will be other parties who will be much more be able to answer that question better than us. I think we would only be able to answer questions in terms of capital market financing or funding of buildings. Sorry about that.
Maybe I will just chip in my thoughts. The land belongs to an owner, and the owner has all the rights to build or not to build. And the owner also have the right to build whatever gazetted to be in the land. If it's residential, then they build residential. If it's gazetted as zone as commercial, then you're able to build a commercial building up to the density or plot ratio allowable by the Majlis. So FTE is based on the preference of the owner whether to build or not to build. The authority were able to scrutinize to make sure that they comply to all the requirement under the law. And that's about it. They can't stop him if I want to build a bungalow right in the middle next to the KLCC, for example. It's the landowner rights to do that. But I think the topic is a little bit diverted. Let's move on to the next one. The next one is by Ahmad Afendi. Has there been any SRI Sukuk financing for conservation project, such as forest restoration?
So far, there hasn't been, but I think that's the whole point of this this sort of program, and the reason why Tech and I are here, and there's so many other capital market players who are out there wanting to talk about this topic. The thing is, this is a very nascent industry. There's a lot of opportunities to finance and fund projects. It's beyond renewable energy. Everyone is very familiar with renewable energy and financing it through a sukuk or a bond. But there's so many other opportunities, so many other industry segments. You got biodiversity, you got transportation, energy efficiency, you got forest protection and green building. So I think what we're saying is there needs to be greater awareness on how you can finance it and fund it. And capital market is happy. We have the products that can help you finance and fund it. And yes, if forestry management is something that there is a demand and there's a supply, there is a product that can be leveraged. Is there anything you'd like to add, Tech?
No, well put, I think, Selena. I think your point about, capital markets players like yourself, like me, being very keen to try to push this agenda onwards, I think, you've driven that home. As I mentioned earlier also, take the opportunity because, it's not defined yet. And I think it's not going to be so easy to define green. But so long as you have, I think, a project which you think is green, then it's just about really trying to make sure it ticks all the other boxes.
Okay, thanks. Let's move on to the next question by Ahmad Amizi. Dear speakers, do you recognize International Renewable Energy Certification, which is IREC, as part of the document supports for financing purpose? For more details, he actually give you a website, www.irecstandard.org, for reference. So, do you guys accept this certification as part of the green definition of green?
Is that?
Maybe I can just give some comment on that. I think with regards to the identification of a project in Malaysia as being green, at least from the capital markets perspective, what we look for is that we look for the second opinion that is provided, as what Zalina mentioned, by other independent bodies. So this includes people like Cicero, RAM Consultancy, the various other providers that are there globally. Now, if you have a certificate from a recognized, I would say, international accreditation agency, that can obviously add to that second opinion that is coming out from these, I would say, other agencies that are recognized in the capital markets. But on a standalone basis, if your question is, just because I have this certificate, is the capital market going to say that this is a green project? The answer is, at this point in time, the answer is no, because we do not yet tick off the 4 points that Zalina also highlighted earlier, which includes the issues around use of proceeds, project evaluation, management of proceeds, and also the reporting commitments. So you also have to fulfill those requirements in addition to just having a certificate.
Could I just add to that, Michael? I think there's a lot of, based on the questions, clearly there's a lot of confusion as to what is defined as green. There's no single definition, but as Tech mentioned, getting a second opinion or getting a rating or assurance by an independent verifier does help the investors and the issuer understand what is green. If you'd like to find out more information, can I suggest that on a global level, if you go to the Climate Bonds Initiative website, they have a section that talks about pre-issuance. Who are the kind of people that you could engage with? So there are people who provide assurance, there are people who provide organizations that provide rating, and there are organizations that provide second-party opinions. And there's sort of like an explanation and also gives you examples of the type of organization that can help you in your journey in identifying whether your project meets the requirements of a green project. So I suggest just go to the Climate Bond Initiative's website and have a look at that. And that will give you a rough idea in terms of the players that could help you in terms of identifying the greenness of your project.
Understood. Okay, let's move on to the next question. Point Punita again, more on a statement rather than a question, but I'll read it through. We can't limit green projects to green building. Agree. I think only 2 green building, the rest are actually solar. So the question is, question R2, first one, what about the following? Manufacturing facility modifying processes using less energy, less water, and other raw material. What they consider green? First one. Second one is wastewater treatment plant. By virtue, it makes something bad to something better. So these 2 would they consider as green project. She also stated that her conversation with MGTC and even the policy didn't touch much on this topic. So do you want to have a feedback on the 2?
Yeah, could I just mention that yes, it's not limited to green building, as you have seen from my presentation very briefly, but we will be happy to share our presentation. It also defines the other kind of projects that meet the green criteria. But some of the areas that you have mentioned here also touches on transition projects. Okay, so by definition, this is an extremely new area. A lot of people are talking about it. And we're trying to figure out how, if there are brown industries who are not clearly defined as green, and they take on projects or include activities within their supply chain to reduce their carbon emissions, doesn't this qualify as green? And I think this is something that is still being discussed. And we'd be happy to sit down and have a call with you to see what areas, or whether your industry is in a brown area, or whether the projects that you're talking about actually by definition fall under green. A very interesting topic, and happy to take this on further with you. Michael, you're on mute, Michael.
Okay, sorry. Let's move on to the next question. Simple one. What would one rate when choosing between a green bond and the SRR Sukuk?
If I could just quickly answer it from a policy point of view, and then you can answer it from a practical point of view. From a policy point of view, when you go down an SRI Sukuk, you sort of widen your investor base in Malaysia, especially. I think when you issue a Sukuk, then you have dedicated funds that can only invest in Islamic investments, and therefore you then open yourself to a targeted set of investors. And that is I would say, the primary difference between a bond and a sukuk. But from a practical point of view, let me pass you on to Thomas, who will give you more practical advice.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to understand that these are all actually subsets of one another, in the sense that the reality is that you can qualify as being a green sukuk and also qualify as being an SRI sukuk at the same time. So we actually have instances where there have been green SRI sukuks that have been issued into the market. And as what Zalina says, I think a lot of the reasons why issuers do this is really down to two main things. One of it is really that of profiling. So, you need to show yourself as a company that is responsible, that, you are ahead of the curve. I think the second point is more economic, which is that you open yourself up to more types of funds, which are, for example, green funds, Islamic funds, SRI funds. So in a nutshell, the more investors that can look at your issuance, the reality is you have what we call in the industry more price tension, because the more demand there is, the more or the less that you have to pay.
Thanks, Dick. Okay, let's move on to the next question from Noor Atika. Based on your previous experiences, after the green project completed and somehow the client is not eligible for the tax deduction, can you share what are likely the issuance contribute to this matter?
I'm not sure whether the question is referring to the green incentives that is under MIDA or the green incentives under fundraising through SRI Sukuk.
Not mentioned.
It's not mentioned. In my experience, I don't think there's been any concern with regard to tax incentives under the green sukuk, the SRI sukuk incentive. So this is probably a MIDA question, I think. I'm not sure what the answer would be for that. Okay.
Possible on MIDA, but MIDA has a set of rules that need to be fulfilled before you can actually enjoy the tax reduction. One of the conditions is actually you must get the MIDA approval before the construction starts. So if you have completed and applied for MIDA and under the current guideline, you will not be eligible. Okay, let's move on. Next question by Nick Safri. Does different bodies governing different green financing regulation frameworks or regulational frameworks are decided only by the government body?
All right, in Malaysia, when it comes to capital market, the primary regulator is the Securities Commission in Malaysia, and they're the only ones who come out with the regulatory framework in this space for capital market. If you're talking about the banking side, then you have Bank Negara, who would provide the regulations and the guidelines in terms of financing products and services on the banking side. At the moment, these are the only two regulators in Malaysia.
Okay, just check my clock. We have 1 more minute and we have last question from Shamil. Dear speakers, what do you think of the current financial incentive for electrical vehicle in Malaysia, especially for the EV infrastructure? And do you think it is enough for the nation to adapt towards using EV?
We're all holding our breath and hoping that 1 minute passes very quickly. Look, I'm speaking from a personal point of view, right? No, it's not enough. You can't depend on financial incentives. Every one of us has to take ownership and do the right thing. So stop looking for finance incentives and decide, let's do the right thing. Let's collectively work as a society and start putting in place sustainable projects, sustainable cars, everything that needs to be done to save the planet. That's my personal pitch.
Thank you. Tek, you have anything else before we wrap it up and move on to the next speakers?
No, none, but just thank you to everyone. I think the key is that there are many questions. Zalina is there, you know, and myself happy to take anything offline. You know, as what Zalina said in her private, her impassioned last minute pitch, that it's all our responsibility. And the reality is that, you know, as a practitioner, I will say that the government has done a lot. The regulators have actually done a lot. Malaysia is really, if you look across the spectrum, I think one of the more forward-looking countries with regards to this. So, you know, if anybody has any green projects or are keen, I think it's you couldn't ask for a better place to launch them.
Thanks, Tek. Zarina, you have anything to move on to summarize? If not,
Ted,
okay.
Very well. Thank you, Tek.
Thank you. Okay, with that, I think if both of you don't mind, please share your slides to the organizer, and we will somehow open up for everybody to download, and especially to Muhammad Nazmi, where he actually requested. With that, thank you very much. We shall move on to the next speaker. Okay, let me introduce the next speaker. Sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, let's move on. The next topic is opportunity with green finance, presented by Sean Kidney, the CEO of Climate Bond Initiative. He is the Climate Bond Initiative is actually an international NGO working to mobilize global capital for climate action. Projects include green bonds, definitions, and certification scheme with 34 trillion of assets represent on its boards, working with the Chinese Central Bank and how to grow green bonds in China. Markets development programs in Brazil, Mexico, Asian and Africa, and market tracking services for green bond industry. Mr. Sean Kidney is a member of the European Commission's platform on sustainable finance and was a member of its precedents, the 2017 EU High-Level Expert Group on Sustainable Finance and the EU Technical Expert Groups on Sustainable Finance. He's also a member of the Green Finance Committee in China, India, Mexico, Kazakhstan. He's also the professor in practice at SOAS University of London. With that, we will have a pre-record session of his presentation. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sean Kidney. I'm the CEO of the Climate Bonds Initiative. We're an NGO that works, would you believe, with promoting green capital, specifically mobilizing global capital for climate action. I want to talk to you today about opportunities with green finance for the building sector. I don't know how much you know about the climate change aspects of buildings. It seems a long way apart. But in the next 30 years, in fact, in the next 10 years, we need to dramatically reduce emissions. The global target, set by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is a reduction of 50% in 10 years in emissions. buildings are one of the largest sources of emissions. That's why I'm talking to you today. We need to make sure that green buildings are everywhere, and there are other benefits as well. But let me step back and look at the bigger picture for a while, and then drill down into the building sections and talk about the opportunities we've now created with a vibrant green finance market. First, we clearly have a global challenge. I think you know a little bit about this in the broader picture, but we're in a world which is heading for catastrophic climate change at the moment. That means a world of severe heat, of firestorms like California is experiencing at the moment, like Australia experienced at the beginning of the year, floods like Bangladesh experienced recently, where Sheikh Hasina put out a message to the world saying that 1/3 of her country was underwater at one point. And these floods are because of, seriously, these floods are because of climate change. Wars, because we know that when we have environmental catastrophe and people have to move because of environmental challenges, we have conflict. And we need to head off that conflict, and when it happens, manage it better than we've managed it in, say, places like Syria, which has been a disaster. And of course, something that we're acutely aware of right now around the world, pandemics. We're in the midst of a COVID crisis. It's been brutal in many parts of the world. Many people have lost valued family relatives. It's been extremely sad for a lot of people, and it's been extremely tough for the economies of many countries as countries have battened down to try and deal with the epidemic. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has been predicting for about 30 years that we will have a century of pandemics. As we degrade our ecosystems, pathogens jump between species, and that creates pandemics, or epidemics first, then pandemics. That's exactly what's happened in southern China with the COVID crisis. We've seen a few of these not quite become pandemics, SARS or MERS from distressed bat colonies in Egypt a few years ago. This one broke through. Others will break through. We need to learn from the crisis that we're experiencing now around the world about how to make our societies more resilient and prepare, and we need to inoculate against the worst possible climate change, which will lead to the worst possible pandemics. That's one of the reasons why people like the Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund talk about the need to build back better. We have to build a future we want to live in and let go the past that we no longer want to live in, or is no longer fit for purpose. I'll come back to how that works in the building sector in a minute. But an important thing to note around climate and around pandemics is we kind of know what the solution is, and where we don't, such as with the pandemic, we are learning incredibly quickly. We've got a global experiment going on now about the best kind of government responses. We know that governments in places like Taiwan, South Korea, New Zealand, and China have responded very effectively with different kinds of tools. Let's learn from those. Whereas other governments like the US or the UK, where I am at the moment, or Western European countries have responded very badly, and they're experiencing the worst impact of the COVID crisis. Things to learn, but things that we already know from climate change is clean energy, low carbon transport. We need more subway lines in Kuala Lumpur and less driving around in traffic, reforestation and sustainable agriculture, and above all, for today's conversation, green buildings. Because buildings, or the built environment, is responsible for some 40% of global emissions. It's incredibly inefficient and it wastes power for you and I. If we can make those buildings much more efficient, we not only reduce our energy bills, not only reduce the amount of power that we need to build in a country, but we reduce emissions because we can close our coal and our gas before we close our clean energy. I mean, that change is underway already in the sense that clean energy costs are plummeting and are now in most countries, most tropical countries, it's going to be cheaper subject to regulation, to build solar than it is to build coal or gas. This is why countries like India have dramatically changed their energy policy in the last few years. But we still have a long lag time before we remove the fossil fuel infrastructure in our society that has to go over the next 30 years. And that one of the things we can do in the meantime is to focus on green buildings. So we know what the solutions are and we have the capital. The truth is, to achieve these changes, we've got to build a lot of stuff. But curiously, in fact, luckily for us, incredibly at the moment, this particular moment in history, we have more capital on the planet than ever before in the history of humanity. And large slabs of that capital are in zero or negative interest rates instruments of one sort or another. In places like Europe, Japan, and the US, interest rates are unbelievably low. In Europe, 21% of institutional investment capital is invested in zero or negative interest rate bonds. That is no way to pay a pension like mine when I retire or yours. So those big pools of capital need to find some kind of yield if they meet their fiduciary responsibilities. At the moment, they're not available. We can create that. Now, it's never that simple, in the sense that there is work to be done to make sure the capital flows from one side of the room where it's currently sitting to the other side of the room where we have all of this work to be done. Some $90 trillion US in emerging markets is what's estimated over the next 30 years is needed. So it's a large pile, but we do have at least $100 trillion in institutional investment capital beyond the other sectors like public sector. So there's capital there. It just has to get to the right place. We have some proof of concept that this works. One of the curious things about the work on capital over the last 20 years is the extent to which major investors are very concerned about climate change or green issues, and they've been voting with their feet. So we've seen the growth of a green bond and a green sukuk market, green Islamic bonds, over the last few years, which has been extraordinary. This is a market that's now $1 trillion outstanding. It's incredibly large. It continues to grow this year, in a COVID year, very, very fast, with associated bonds like sustainability bonds and social bonds using the green bond format also growing very fast. Why? Because investors like the reporting and transparency aspects of these things, which gives them a sense that there is more information available than there has been in the past about their investments. They get also risk mitigation because this particular universe has something very special. Bonds or loans or other forms of finance linked to the green format are less risk. Why do I say that? Because global investors now are 100% certain that we are going to see a change. That is, that in countries are beginning to act on climate change. In fact, they're so convinced they're going to act on climate change, they are terrified of the consequences of policy impact on their portfolio in areas where they can't tell. We've already seen some examples of these. In the last few weeks, 2 incredible milestones have happened in Europe and in the US. First, Exxon dropped out of the Standard & Poor's 100, and Exxon's market capitalization was eclipsed by Next Era, which is a renewable energy company in the US. It is smaller than Next Era now. In Europe, BP, the petroleum company, has had its market capitalization overtaken by Ørsted, which is a Danish wind energy company with investments all around the world, the largest wind energy company. This is extraordinary. Their actual returns on equity are not equivalent, but people are betting that the renewable energy companies are going to be much bigger in the future than the likes of Exxon or BP. In the same way, they continue to bet that companies like Google or Tesla are going to be much bigger in the future than the legacy companies that they're competing against. And there's some evidence that's the case. Most of the stock market gain in the US the last 10 years has come from Silicon Valley companies. So there's some reason to look for it. All I know is investors are telling me, tell us what's a safe investment going forward. In the bond space or the debt space, investors are particularly concerned about capital retention. Larry Fink, the head of BlackRock, once said that he didn't make money by giving investors yields or returns on the debt. He made money by making sure they didn't lose their money. Capital retention is everything in debt markets. So a universe of investments that are seen to be lower risk than others because they're less likely to be impacted by policy risk is extremely exciting for an investor. And that's why in US dollars, in euros, and in other currencies, we are seeing very clear price differences between green bonds and ordinary bonds. Now, remember that there is no difference when it comes to the underlying of a green instrument versus a non-green instrument, including a sukuk. If you're doing a sukuk or a bond, anyone can do it. A bank, a corporate, a government can do it, and there are a lot of governments who've issued bonds in this area at the moment, or in sukuk, the Indonesian government. The only difference is that you are promising to ensure that the proceeds are used for qualifying green investments. It's as simple as that. Qualifying green investments. We're going to have to come back to that particular point in the building sector in a minute. So that's all it is. And from a full faith and credit perspective, these bonds are exactly the same. In fact, the German government recently made a point of showing the difference. It issued 2 bonds on the same day about 2 months ago, 6.5 billion euros of green bonds and an ordinary, what they call a vanilla German bond the same day. They got interest rates which are negative, extraordinary. People are paying them for them to look after their money, minus 0.46% interest rates. But the green bond, which is no different in terms of the credit aspect of it, the German government fully guarantees it in the same way as it guarantees a normal bond, got a 1 basis point low interest rate. At negative interest rate, this is incredible. So we now see price differences of from 1 basis point at negative interest rate up to 5, 8, 15, 30 basis points, depending on the rating level. If you can issue a bond and you've got the green assets, you would be mad not to look at the green format. And that applies to sukuk in Malaysia too, with the Malaysian Securities Commission and Bank Negara, but particularly the Securities Commission, has been very active in promoting a sukuk market around social and sustainable bonds. And we've seen a number of green sukuk issued in Malaysia for renewable energy companies. What we haven't seen, the missing element here, is property. Let me take you into a little bit more in the property sector and what's been happening in this. So this market grew initially around clean energy, solar, renewables, and that's exactly what's happened in Malaysia, where green sukuk in particular have been issued relating to solar investments and so on. But globally, we've seen a rapid growth in transport, which is both electric rail and electric vehicles, and buildings, so that 30% of the global market now is related to green property bonds. That's $300 billion or so, which has been issued globally. Fannie Mae is the largest issuer, which is the US secondary mortgage company. Freddie Mac is a big one, but real estate trusts and banks around the world have been issuing in this area. In Singapore, for example, CDL was the first ever issuer of green property bonds in that country. In Australia, we've seen Investor, which is a real estate trust, and now getting its entire portfolio certified so we can issue in the market. These companies are lucky they've got the assets to be able to do it. And we've seen banks, everyone from Berlin Hyp in Germany to Barclays in the UK, issue large-scale green bonds in this particular area. So there's no reason not to. There may be some structuring challenges if you're looking at sukuk, but we've seen sukuk in the property market, so it should not be insurmountable. So this is a large area, but it's not in Malaysia. And so that's to me, highlights an incredible opportunity we have in Malaysia. Green bond issuance is global. About 30% is in emerging markets. China is the biggest emerging market issuer. The second one is India. But we have seen significant issuance from the Philippines, Thailand, Indonesia, and even Vietnam in the ASEAN area. So it is a global phenomenon. Let me take you into the qualifying aspects of the building sector. So how do you get access to all of these? There are a set of rules that have been developed globally by the Climate Bonds Initiative, which are being applied in every country. You don't have to use those rules. There are options. You can get what's called a second opinion, an independent review, which looks at the environmental credentials of the bond and then puts out a statement to the public, to the investors, that they can interrogate and they can make their own decisions. That's useful if it's complicated. If it's relatively simple, best to keep to the rule sets that are common. The idea of these rule sets is we're looking for buildings that are consistent with achieving, or material to achieving, the Paris climate change objectives. There's a very simple idea, which is the built environment is not perfect and has to get better. So the idea of the market is to push quality in the market. Buildings at the moment, and this climate bonds criteria, or in the new European taxonomy criteria, let me just tell you about that for a minute. The European Union is developing rules called an EU taxonomy for the disclosure of all sustainable investments in Europe. They'll come into force in 2 months. Any investor, bank, or corporate, or even member state, a little later in the piece, that wants to call something sustainable or green will need to reference this thing called a taxonomy, which is like a shopping list of projects. Finally, we will have comparability between different institutions' claim around sustainability. For green bonds, if a green bond is issued, it will have to meet the criteria in the taxonomy. This taxonomy is loosely based on the climate bonds taxonomy. It's been around for some years that some people might be familiar with. Many of the criteria, like in the building sector, are the same as in the climate bonds taxonomy. If you want to engage a European investor or a bank, you will give them no benefit if your assets or projects don't meet the European taxonomy, because they won't be able to call them green or sustainable in the European environment. They won't be able to tell a regulator, which is very important for them, as you can imagine, that these are green. They won't be eligible for green quantitative easing that the European Central Bank is bringing in. Many incentives start appearing. We have a similar situation in China, where PBOC, the central bank, supported a green projects catalogue as the guidance for the green bonds market, now the world's largest in China, some years ago, 5 years ago. They updated that catalogue just a couple of months ago. This particular catalogue is very detailed, very broad. It excludes fossil fuel electricity generation, for example, as the European catalogue does, for reasons that are embedded in the science. I won't go into that detail now. Please come back to me if you want to find out more. In the building sector, the Chinese catalogue is very tough because the government is not very keen to promote investment in the building sector. That will change, we think, a little bit this year. You have to be a China 3 Green Star building to qualify there, which is a very tough hurdle rate. There aren't that many buildings in China that meet it. But there's some developments in the Green Star scheme which allow a few more buildings to be involved. So let's look at the international climate bonds, which are currently operating largely in ASEAN. So the first measure is, for the moment, a building that is in the top 15% of similar stock in a city like Kuala Lumpur or Penang will qualify. This is a relatively simple rule. It does require an understanding of what is the average emissions or energy intensity of a building in Kuala Lumpur or Penang. We've got to work that out. There are proxies available. If you qualify under the IFC's, the World Bank's International Finance Corporation's EDGE scheme, which is a building labelling scheme they run, you qualify for certification. If you qualify under LEED, gold or platinum, not silver, not basic, gold or platinum, with ASHRAE 90.1, which is a measure as part of LEED for what the emissions are. Those of you who are specialists will understand what that particular measure is. Then you can qualify for certification. We're looking at other mechanisms that can be used as proxies going forward, but that's as far as we've got at the moment in Malaysia. In Singapore, the Green Star labelling scheme can be used, and there's a bit more detail I can provide about that. However, if we can establish baseline measures in a city like Penang, then we can simply do it on the basis of the calculated emissions of a building or energy performance of a building, which can be calculated from the size of the building and the energy bill. So bear that in mind. This measure is a changing measure. Every 5 years, it'll get a little bit tougher. So let's say that we establish the Penang measure at something like 10 tons of carbon per CO2 per square meter. In 5 years' time, in 2025, that'll get a little bit tougher. It'll get tougher and tougher until 2050, when you will have to be a zero net carbon building to be able to qualify anywhere in the world. And that's consistent with the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Committee on Climate Change's trajectory of change for the world. So it's a moving feast. Now, if you issue a green sukuk or green bond, you'll need to make sure that your building continues to qualify as that measure gets a little bit tougher. So you have an inbuilt incentive to keep improving the efficiency of that particular building. That's step one. Step two, you can do renovations. That is, if you are renovating a shopping centre, if you're improving the emissions of that shopping centre by 30%, you can count the renovation cost. So that's another option for real estate property trusts or banks. Finally, if you are doing individual measures, and this is typically relevant for lenders to small business, you can add all the bits and pieces involved, subject to checking that they're on a list, which is available publicly, with things like smart meters, LED lighting, or upgrade of heat pumps, or so on. So all of those things are just in both the installation of them and the manufacturing of them. So if you're a bank like Maybank and you're running a lending program for SMEs, and it's possible to identify small business that meet these criteria, then they can get a benefit. Now, this begs the question of what is the benefit? I've mentioned earlier, if you're able to issue debt, you've got to be large. You can't be a small company. In Malaysia, probably about $25 million equivalent in ringgit is the minimum size. Globally, you've got to have at least $100 million US equivalent to be able to issue debt in this area. So this is for larger organizations, not smaller. It's for real estate conglomerates. It's not for individual real estate developers. If you do that, you can shave the cost of capital. Now, if you're shaving the cost of capital, on 30 million, it may not be a huge amount, but on $500 million, it becomes quite a lot of money. And so it becomes material and really worth doing. There are other benefits too. You will get greater access to capital. What we find is anyone who issues green debt gets much greater subscription levels for their debt, which is one of the reasons the price goes down. You've got more buyers in the market, essentially. It's essentially easier to raise capital. In Russia, we have a situation where, thanks to sanctions and the like, that many companies cannot raise capital at all in the very low interest rate Western markets. But if they issue a green bond, they can. Russian Railways, for example, recently issued 2 bonds, one in euros and one in Swiss francs in the European market. They had no problem finding buyers for those bonds. They had so many buyers that they got the lowest interest rates ever in the history of a Russian state-owned enterprise issuing debt in the European market. There is appetite for green where there is no appetite at all in some other markets. Now, that's incredibly useful if you're trying to get access to capital, or if you're new to the market, or you try to break through into a new market. So that's the key benefit. Remember that if this universe continues to be seen, as we believe it will, because of the regulatory steps that are coming back up, as a universe of lower cost investments, this appetite will grow. We have, for example, central banks around the world, including Bank Negara in Malaysia, looking at things like a taxonomy for Malaysia, but also how they can support green finance, green bonds, green sukuk, with incentives of various sorts. In China, the incentives are incredible. If you're a bank and you're trying to borrow wholesale capital from the central bank, the People's Bank of China, you can post green bonds as collateral, the liquidity lending window, and you get a 1% discount on wholesale funds. That's a very nice incentive. You get different macroprudential scoring, etc., etc. In Europe, the European Central Bank has now introduced green quantitative easing, where it'll prioritize purchases of green bonds going forward over other bonds for its QE program. We've seen some central banks, the Hungarian Central Bank was the first to this, to introduce risk weighting differential in the capital ratio requirements of banks if they post green property bonds, if they hold green property bonds. So if you're a Hungarian bank and you've made loans to green buildings, you will get a differential leverage ratio when you're working at your capital ratio requirements. For a bank, this is gold dust. You're going to see a lot more benefits along these lines. They will all be linked to this taxonomy definition of what counts as green, and that's what you're looking at the screen now. Now, if you're a developer and you're looking at building owners as your customers, trying to convince them to improve the greenness of the building is often not a very successful activity, partly because the tenants pay the energy bills and so on. We now have a different twist here. When you're talking to your customers, you will say, with these minor changes to improve the energy efficiency or emissions efficiency of your building, you will have a better chance of raising capital in capital markets. That's the twist. That is the gold dust in this whole opportunity that I'm talking about today. You can do two separate things if you're doing a green bond in this particular market. You can issue a bond against a specific asset, or you can do something that's called programmatic certification, which is you can have a program of buildings. You can get a whole real estate trust, or you can say, this whole development over 5 years will qualify. I want to certify the whole lot in one go, and then I'll just issue debt as I need to, as my drawdowns become available, or as the assets get completed and come on stream as revenue earning. So there's a very interesting opportunity for large scale owners of assets or for banks that are running large programs. So when we're pitching to people, you should be doing energy efficiency, bear this in mind. These are the ways of making it easier for them to raise green debt going forward. A couple of case studies for you. In this particular one, Bank Colombia, which is Colombia's largest bank, introduced incentives for green mortgages. They copied the idea from Barclays in the UK, who'd been the first one to do this. They issued a green bond, which in their case was 2.8 times oversubscribed, very high for Colombia. They then, as a result of that, looked at offers for developers and home buyers. There was a variable loan of green construction that was less than conventional market rates. That allowed them to bring in some loans to support their green bond. Then they also offered 65 basis points discount for home buyers for the first 7 years of their loans, effectively green mortgages. Barclays, just so you know, offered 25 basis points discount off the life of the mortgage. They ensured there was some technical expert assistance available for developers and the like. As a result, 15,000 homes was certified as low carbon and low energy. And the program is now at $400 million US. Very exciting program, all kicked off with the green bond. In Kenya, the country's first green bond was issued by Acorn, which is a property developer. It was linked to a 50 million structuring by Stanbic Bank. The proceeds were used for student accommodation certified by that IFC program, EDGE, that I mentioned to you earlier, who provided a certification that allowed it to get climate bond certification on the back of that. And the government has now made interest from green bonds tax exempt, a nice sweetener, but that came afterwards. That wasn't part of the decision-making that led them to actually do it. So this is how it can work for people. Looking next. Clearly, we are going to see more value for market participants. I mentioned the value retention aspect for investors. When we get a downturn, by the way, that is the bond market, in the bond market, we see the green bonds hold their value. They become what's called a capital retention tool for investors, which means we have investors piling in who don't care about the green aspects, who do it just because they're less likely to lose their money if they hold green bonds. It's a risk reduction opportunity for them. When it comes down to picking assets that are less likely to default, the risk reduction stuff is palpable. People are very clear now about what's happening in the energy sector. People are extremely conscious around what is likely to happen in the auto sector. Thanks to China's policy steps, shifting the whole country to electric vehicle, there is no future for any car company that is not aggressively investing in electric. This is why we see the German giants issuing electric. It's not because the German government has pushed them, it's because the Chinese market is pulling them. And we've seen green bonds issued not only by Geely in China, but also by VW, Daimler, and Porsche now in Germany. That will grow. What's going to happen in the Proton and the Malaysian car industry is a question the government really needs to consider carefully. But I'm going to tell you now, investors have already considered it. Money is shifting. You will get lower rates if you're issuing debt for electric vehicle loans. And Porsche said to me recently, they got an amazing deal on their green bond, which is actually a green Schuldschein, a type of loan format in the German market, as did Daimler, the best interest rate that ever had in history. We're going to see a lot more of this for electric vehicle-related investments. Now, that means that investors are now looking at different areas at differential risk. Buildings that are low emissions and energy efficient are less risk of being affected by future policy changes than ones that aren't. In the Netherlands, the Dutch Central Bank has regulated to say that banks are not allowed, it is now illegal, to make loans to buildings that are below a certain energy efficiency level. We are going to see a lot of these. It will eventually hit Malaysia. So in terms of the ability of a building to pay back its debt, these are material issues. So these are benefits for investors. For issuers, it translates into differential access to capital and pricing benefits in certain currencies. In Malaysian ringgit, hasn't showed up yet because we haven't seen enough issuance. But I can tell you in hard currencies, it's very clear and very palpable. There are many research reports on our website you can look at. For ESCOs, energy services companies, this is a new sale argument for people who have ownership over buildings to do something around energy and emissions reductions, which is there's a capital raising benefit for the owners of the building. This is way more powerful than a reduced cost benefit because the cost is not necessarily borne by the owner of the building. Here we're saying the owner of the building has a benefit in ensuring that emissions and energy are considered because that'll be easy for them to raise capital going forward. Bear that in mind. Anyone can do this. Clearly, real estate trusts could be issuing bonds like Investor or in Australia or CDL in Singapore. Clearly, banks could be issuing bonds, as they are around the world, to refinance portfolios of loans to green buildings of one sort or another. Cities could be issuing bonds to finance programs to support it. Governments could be issuing bonds to finance tax credits for energy efficiency homes, as France has. France now has 25 billion euros of sovereign green bonds outstanding, and the first big tranche of that went to energy efficiency tax credits, very warmly accepted by the market, and so on and so on and so on. The next thing we're going to have to do is to make it very easy for people to understand how they qualify. The Malaysian Central Bank, Bank Negara, is working on this at the moment, and we expect to see clearer guidance in line with the international definitions that I've already spoken to you about coming out next year. We will see central banks and other regulators take more steps to address climate risk. The ASEAN Capital Markets Forum in April this year received a very important paper on sustainable finance in ASEAN. It outlines measures for regulators to take in ASEAN. We know the Malaysian Securities Commission is one of the leaders in this area, and we expect more measures. Of course, in the meantime, we have something very important, which is COVID. We have to recover from the pandemic. We have to rebuild our economies over the next 18 months. And we have to make sure there is a big focus on jobs. Well, I can tell you from other markets, like Europe, like US, at least the Biden campaign, and as is happening in other countries around the world, there is a tight focus on building back better. How we create the kind of economy which is future fit for a world of climate change and climate risk, and doesn't rebuild the kinds of assets which are legacy ones or need to be seen as legacy ones going forward. One of the areas where that discussion is very real, because it creates jobs, is the construction industry. So we're now seeing incentives all over the place for energy efficient buildings. In Europe, where a 750 billion euro fund has been created for recovery and resilience, half of which will go in grants and half of which will go in loans to member states around Europe. One of the areas which is high on the agenda is support in various forms for building for green, for energy efficiency investments, with a focus on immediate job creation by boosting the construction aspect involved in doing that, from private homes to large commercial buildings. Now, we don't know yet how the commercial building market's going to survive this, whether more and more people are going to be working from home or whatever. But one thing we do know, the home market is going to still be there and continue to grow. So investments in that sector are very safe investments. And if we can make them energy efficient, if we can get government support through this, then it's going to make the equation even easier going forward. We have an incredible opportunity arising out of the last 2 years. Last year, we saw the massive growth of green finance, green bonds, green sukuk around the world. We have a market that's about $1 trillion US outstanding now. We have a green loan market, which is direct loans between banks and others to corporates and so on, which is also about $1 trillion outstanding. And that's fueling interest in places like China, where there are many more loans than bonds. This year, in the pandemic, in the midst of brutal impact on our economies, on our societies, and on our loved ones, we've also seen an understanding that we can change, that we can change fast when the pressure's there. That gives us a sense of opportunity, because we have to change if we're to create a future for our children. And we have to change the built environment. Cities in the future must be, it's not a choice, must be clean and green. Yes, that means trees, much more in the way of green stuff. Yes, that means more public transport. Yes, that means denser environments, but above all, It means energy efficient and low emissions, intelligent buildings that use air conditioning way, way, way more effectively and smartly than we currently use now, that are designed, not just tacked on afterwards, but designed to be highly efficient and lower emissions. And the capital's there and it wants green. We can make this work. That's the opportunity. Thank you for being with me today.
Everything is smooth. We have a couple of questions. Perhaps we can start with the questions and then we can elaborate later.
Sure.
Okay, the first one. How does someone issue a green bond? Simple question for you.
Sure, it's very simple. You have to be able to issue a bond, whether green or not. That's the first step. If you can't issue a bond, you're not going to be able to issue a green bond.
Okay.
So that means you've got to be creditworthy. You're going to have to convince a structurer or a bank that it's worth selling your debt to some customers and opening up their very precious customer lists to you. Or you can do a direct placement. If you find an investor who's interested in giving you a loan, they can do it in the form of a bond, private placement, or a sukuk. And you can structure it just for them. That works as well too. And they'll make their own decisions on your creditworthiness. If you've got a small loan that you want to raise or a small sukuk, then you're likely to do a private placement. But just the key point is it's no different to raising debt. It's just that the green flavor gives you some extra benefits.
Thanks. Let's move on to the second one. Another easy one for you. Is the cost of the capital really so important to the building owner?
So this is an opportunity for those of us who are trying to convince building owners to upgrade their buildings. For people who own buildings, the opportunity to finance or refinance that through a bond, like a green bond, actually is pretty big.
Yeah.
And if you're doing a $500 million green bond, for example, and you can shave something off the cost of capital, it can actually be quite a lot of money, way more than the savings from introducing energy efficiency measures in a building, especially as the tenant often picks up the power bills, so the building owner gets no benefit. So this is actually a really important thing and can be major. Remember that treasurers, people who issue debt, they're in the business of shaving the cost of capital all the time. So if you give them a tool to lower the cost of capital, and let's say you're an ESCO, an energy services company, and you say, I'm going to put in some equipment in your building, I'm going to make it pay in 2 years' time or 3 years' time, good return on investment. And as well as that, you're going to shave money off the cost of capital. It's that last one that'll probably swing the deal. And that's why it's important to focus on it and to, makes a huge difference. I sat down once for a cup of coffee with the manager of the world's largest building management company in New York. He manages billions and billions and billions dollars of assets around the world. And the only reason he was talking to me is because he was interested in how green bonds could be used, and the opportunity to get lower cost capital could be used as a way of selling his services in to real estate companies. And he's been doing it. So I figure if he thinks it's going to work, we should all get on the bandwagon.
Okay. Noted on that. Okay, let's jump to the next question. Why do the regulators and central banks care about green investment?
Because they're worried that the economy is going to hit storms. That the impact of climate change and the impact of governments like China and the European Union changing policy to address climate change is going to lead to lots of risk for banks and financial institutions. And their job is to reduce risk. Their job is to make sure that the future is smooth sailing and as stable as possible. So thanks to the work of the Bank of International Settlements Task Force on Climate Finance Related Disclosure, there is a really heightened awareness amongst folks like Bank Negara on what the forward risk looks like if you don't take steps. So as a result, central banks around the world now, and there's an association of 72 of them in the network for greening the financial system, are now looking at what they can do to reduce forward risk. And the key thing is, they're saying the nature of the volatility we're going into means the past is no guide to the future. So this association of central banks has put out a report 3 months ago on scenario planning. If you're the Bank of Japan, for example, and you're looking at what kind of regulation you need in the future, don't look at the past, look at what these scenarios could be for the future and figure out then the optimum settings for you to ensure that your banks don't go bust. And that means much greater exposure and transparency around high carbon risk, oil, coal, things like that, vehicles too, if you're in a company invested or lending to a company that invests in fossil fuel cars, and much higher exposure to sustainable investments too. So you know which banks and financial institutions have lesser risk going forward because they've shifted their portfolios over to sustainable investments. And this is important, right?
Yeah.
Because when you're looking at buildings, the logical flow on of this is buildings that are highly energy efficient and green and sustainable are much lower risk going forward because there's less chance that governments are going to take policy steps to close them down. You know, in the Netherlands, the Dutch central bank has now made it illegal for banks to make loans to energy inefficient buildings. Illegal. That's an example of policy risk coming through the system. So the regulators want to get ahead of that and start understanding how to do it. And what that's going to mean is there are going to be incentives for holders of assets that are green, like green buildings.
Okay, great to know that. Next question is by Lim. Has there been any example in UK of the use of blockchain technology for the issuance and the investment of green bonds?
No.
Okay.
But look, let me put it this way. Blockchain is plumbing.
Yeah.
It's how the system works. So it's the business of banks in particular, but other financial sector payment services and the like, to look at IT solutions that maximize trust and reduce friction. Clearly, blockchain solutions are part of that. Blockchain in relation to the green aspect, no, because we don't have a problem at the moment anyway with trusting the green claims, because we've got existing mechanisms like the Malaysian Green Building Council to be able to assess buildings. So that hasn't been a big challenge. The major challenge and the area where blockchain is really making a difference is in back-end systems. I'm going to call that the plumbing of the financial sector. But in terms of green, no, we haven't seen that. And we don't see that in the near future, maybe as things, as time goes on.
How about other countries? Would you think that
that's a global answer, not a UK answer. I actually have no idea what's happening in the UK. I know a lot more about Europe and China.
Okay. The next one is from Angeline. In your opinion, what do you think about the implementing electric car here in Malaysia in large range in terms of geographically?
Malaysia is a perfect country for electric cars. The range that people have to drive, frankly, is not that big compared to places like Australia or the Soviet Union. We have substantial range increases in electric vehicles, but it's a bit academic, because what China's doing to drive the whole country to electric, and it's the largest car market in the world, means that if you're a car company that wants to sell cars in China, you cannot do petrol anymore. You have to do electric. And the impact of that means that the capital cost of producing an electric car is dropping like a stone. It's like solar. In about 2 years, if you're in Kuala Lumpur, you're going to wander into a showroom and you're going to see electric cars that have a range equivalent to current petrol cars and they get cheaper on a capital expenditure basis. They're already cheap on an operational expenditure basis. If you're running a fleet in Kuala Lumpur, a fleet of taxis, actually it's going to be cheaper for you to have electric. But it takes time for these changes to happen. So it's pretty well game over, to be honest, in the electric world. If you're not, as a manufacturer, and most importantly, as a car parts supplier, looking to electric, you have a good chance of going bust in the next 2 to 5 years. You've got to get ahead of that. And this is a big issue for Proton and what it does as a car company, right? Because it has not invested adequately in this transition. It is behind the times. So unless it changes quickly, it's going to be killed, I'm afraid, by rapid changes in Chinese car manufacturers and then Japanese and German that are following the Chinese, because China is the biggest market. Like when cars become 20% and 30% cheaper because they're electric, no amount of tariff barriers and so on are going to be able to support you.
Yeah.
So I'm going to say to Proton, and more to the point, the supplier network, have a strategy for change right now. Time is running out.
I'll make sure I'll pass this message to Proton. Okay, next one from Asmin. What is the goal roadmap for green bond?
So green bonds are not an end game. Green bonds are an instrument that are useful. But they do other things. They unlock other things. Essentially, they're proof that if you construct investments that meet the risk yield requirements of investors and also address green, they will invest. You go to any issuer now and ask them how their green bond went compared to their ordinary bond, and they're going to say, whoa, it was incredible. And we've been interviewing treasurers lately, and I can tell you, we had 2 hours discussion with the German Treasury a couple of days ago, and their sovereign green bond, which got a negative interest rate. I mean, wouldn't you like to get that? They got a negative interest rate. It was so that for 6.5 billion euros they placed, they had 33 billion or something of orders for it, of people trying to buy their green bond. And as a result, they got a lower price for it, even though it was negative interest rate. So the demand is so strong and the energy behind this is so strong that it does a whole lot of things apart from good treasury, lower cost of funding in hard currency at least. It really excites people within organizations. I was speaking to the Porsche group treasurer a couple of days ago on a panel, and he said to me that when they issued their 1 billion green bond for an electric Porsche, which by the way is going to be way faster than the petrol Porsche if you're one of those kinds of car heads, they got so much energy inside the company about, whoa, we're doing this, it's happening, transition. So it fueled the internal transition energy of the company. For governments who can do it, it excites them about the potential to meet their public policy objectives with capital raising, which they hadn't been thinking about before. And it opens up all sorts of discussions. We see now treasuries convening groups of ministries to talk about what else they're doing on climate change that could go into their green bond, because the green bond gets some lower cost of capital. So there's all that sort of further work. But what's most important about it all is we've managed to convince the world that investing in a green and sustainable solution is not a loss. It's not negative. It's actually positive. You can make money while doing good. And in fact, you'll probably make more money. We've already known about this in green buildings for a long time, but in capital, this is a relatively new idea. The real icing on the cake is if you're in the green space, as represented by the new EU taxonomy, for example, which is a shopping list for the Paris Agreement, you are lower risk. So if you're an investor, anything that's in the space is not going to be hit by policy change going forward, and therefore it is lower risk, and therefore it is very exciting for bond investors. And that's what we're going to make work in the building sector.
Yep, agree. Okay, I'll move on to the next question. In Malaysia, with the advance of energy efficiency and renewable energy, is it possible to make towards zero energy buildings?
Michael, you'd know better than I would.
Possible, of course. There's a few buildings that is actually testing to go net zero building, but predominantly at the moment, they are low rise and with big roof, which able to have a lot of renewable energy.
Yes, I think this is changing quite well. I mean, the main thing is we need to get our energy use dramatically down really quickly and address a whole lot of other environmental and sustainability issues like water use, etc. This is what we've got to do. There are so many easy wins. You know, the idea of the perfect building is nice, but not the most critical issue at the moment. The most critical issue is the bulk of our buildings, I'm going to say, are bad performers when it comes to energy and water and other issues. So let's also look at the whole the urban fabric while we're at it. It's not just individual buildings, it's how we integrate in a city. Better public transport, integration between public transport and walking and other kinds of activity like bicycling or whatever might work for people. Green space, the extent to which we're building and planning for very green cities and green space everywhere, which, by the way, can lower the temperature of an urban area by up to 5 degrees, depending where you are. All of these things are really critical issues too about how we go forward. So it's not just specifically the narrow building envelope. It's the place in which the space in which the building sits. There's all these things we're going to do. But yes, energy is getting much more efficient in terms of the amount of energy per square meter. We do think that over the next 20 years, it will be possible to get enough energy coming from an urban area to make a substantial difference to the footprint of individual buildings. It's going to change a lot, but look, just don't worry about the perfect. You know, we have a situation now where 40% of our emissions, or the emission reductions we have to achieve, I should say, in the next 30 years come from buildings and the built environment. So if we can make a dramatic shift as this thing from getting it perfect, we are helping the planet. And if you can get it perfect, if you can do what Michael was saying, go for it. But there may be cost imposts to make a net zero building or at the moment, which just make it unviable. But you know, I'll be very happy with a shopping centre that sits in the top 5 or 10% of buildings in Malaysia. I will shout from the rooftops and say, hurrah, hurrah.
Unfortunately, time is running up, and we will have our last question. Will the government or bank support for green project, for example, the green landscape restoration? So, not green, forest landscape restoration, yes.
Look, I think is the best answer. You know, I can't comment on the specific programs that are part of the policy ambitions of the current government in Malaysia. You're going to have to interrogate those. But there's one thing that you know in asking the question. We need reforestation, and that's absolutely correct. We have a lot of degraded land that needs reforesting. But perhaps as importantly, let me say, we need to better manage the land that we're farming now to ensure that we're farming in ways for maximizing sequestration and ensuring sustainability. There's a lot we can do with the existing lands as well to improve our activity. So do ask questions of your friends that are experts in the area, because it is complicated, but it's so critically important. In one study by an international UN think tank, they think that something like 25 to 30% of all emissions on the planet could be soaked up with better soil practices in farming, especially in tropical zones. It gives you an opportunity, a sense of the opportunity in front of us if we think much better, much more cleverly about how we farm and reforest wherever we can.
Thank you. I think that's all for the questions. You have 1 minute to summarize whatever things that you want to the audience to know.
There's opportunity here. Remember, there's opportunity in the capital raising side. You've probably never thought about this. It could make a big difference to real estate trusts, to banks, to people who own the bulk of property in our cities. Make it work.
Thanks, Sean. Hope everybody in this virtual conference webinar is able to learn something today. With that, I'll pass it back to Alina. Thank you very much, Sean. Have a pleasant
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you to our moderator, Mr. Michael, and our panel of knowledgeable experts, Ms. Zalina Shamsuddin, Mr. Thomas Yeo, and Mr. Sean Kidney for all of your insights. We hope that this segment helped increase your understanding on green bonds and green sukuks, as well as what projects can be constituted as green. Thank you very much for your active participation in day 1 of the Financing Climate Action Conference. I hope you will join us for day 2 and day 3 of the program as well, happening tomorrow and Thursday. Thank you.